The Warren Commission's case against Lee Harvey Oswald seems open and shut.
I positively know nothing about this.
A disgruntled ex-Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union and is vocal in his support of Castro. On November 22nd, he's working at the Texas School Book Depository, a building with a perfect view of the presidential motorcade. Oswald's own rifle, found stashed on the 6th floor, delivers the fatal shots.
Either Oswald did the shooting, or the shooting was done by someone else using Oswald's gun. That's really what it comes down to.
But why didn't Oswald attempt to escape immediately? Instead, he hangs around the building for a while, later telling authorities he was in the lunchroom downstairs when the president is shot. A Dallas policeman who rushes to the building less than 2 minutes after the shooting reports seeing Oswald on the floor where the lunchroom is located.
So Oswald would have had to fire those fatal shots, race to the opposite end of the 6th floor where the rifle was stashed, come back to where the door was, go down 6 flights of stairs, and then be standing there calm, cool, and collected when the policeman showed up.
Many eyewitnesses tell police that they heard other shots from the front of the president's motorcade, the infamous grassy knoll of Dealey Plaza. The Warren Commission dismisses these accounts in its 1964 report, determining that Oswald fires alone from the book depository. But even 2 of Kennedy's top aides, riding in the limo directly behind the president's, insist that there was more than one shooter.
Both of these men were World War II veterans, so they knew the sound of gunfire, and they were convinced that the shots, including the fatal shot that took away part of the president's head, were fired from the front.
Dave Powers, one of those White House aides, in a startling admission to researcher Tom Hartman shortly before he dies, describes being pressured to change his testimony to investigators.
I asked him, why didn't you tell the Warren Commission this? And he said, I tried to, I would have liked to. I kept getting interrupted whenever I got to that.
So many omissions that make the Warren Commission's declaration that Oswald acted alone so hard to believe. But is the complex and sinister plot, detailed by Hartman and Waldron, the truth about what happened that terrible day in Dallas?
It surely adds dots to the picture that we have of what happened.
It's not the dots that are troubling to other assassination investigators. It's the connections between them. To believe that the mob could infiltrate the Kennedys' secret plan to oust Castro, you must first believe such a plan was actually going to happen.
The Kennedys had no imminent plan to invade Cuba. Of course, there were always contingency plans. The Kennedys were constantly looking at various scenarios.
There is no doubt Castro was a thorn in Kennedy's side. The 1963 coup plan could simply be one possible scenario to resolve the Cuba issue.
But I believe that these authors, Mr. Waldron and Hartman, have confused what were contingency plans for the real deal.
But if AM World was simply a contingency plan, why would this once secret document mention a general uprising scheduled for December 1st? That's the clock that runs the assassination timeline. The mobsters knew they had to get Kennedy before the coup, or their leverage would be gone.
The idea that this was going to culminate on December 1, 1963, it's based on a reading of a single document where somebody says, we're going to do something soon, and attaches a date to it. There's no other basis for saying that something big was going to happen on that date, and there's lots of evidence that it wasn't going to happen.
But not all evidence needs to be in black and white to suggest the plan was in motion.
AM World was not a contingency plan. AM World was an active operation. We met with and interviewed people who were involved in it, who were inside it.
If there was such a plan, why did none of Kennedy's top advisors, including Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, know anything about it?
They believe that even someone as high in the government as the Secretary of Defense didn't know about this very imminent U.S. invasion plan. I think that's preposterous.
Perhaps it wasn't a question of who would be told about the plan, but when.
There is a memo in which it appears that a meeting was going to be called involving people like McNamara and Secretary of State Rusk, who had not been told that all this planning was for a real coup plan. That meeting was to be held 3 days after JFK went to Dallas.
But if all that's true, could the mob really have pulled off the ultimate hit?
The mafia wasn't capable of the kind of political calculations that are being imputed to them in the book.
The mafia figures come off like Washington insiders, believing they can cover up their involvement in the assassination, since an investigation could expose the Kennedys' Cuban coup plan and ignite nuclear war.
Their view of the mafia is some awesome hybrid between Tony Soprano and Henry Kissinger.
But the mob's vast empire and connections to the political world are testament to their power.
These guys were running business empires that rivaled General Motors. I mean, they were not Hicks from Sicily.
And then there's this. If Kennedy did have a plan to topple Castro, the mobsters would never want to stop it. They'd welcome it.
Havana was a huge source of income for the mafia. They were desperate to get back there. Why on earth would the mob kill President Kennedy on the eve of the U.S. government's plot to get rid of Castro? That just doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't make sense if Havana was the mafia's only gold mine. But it wasn't.
Cuba was small potatoes. They were doing very well in other places. They were building an empire in the Bahamas. They had infiltrated Las Vegas. You know, Cuba was a fly on the back of an elephant for them.
Finally, there's the portrait of Lee Harvey Oswald as the mafia's fall guy.
Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't the mob's boy. He beat them to Kennedy. They would have pinned a medal on him, but he just wasn't doing it for them.
Lamar Waldron insists the evidence shows Oswald was tied to mobster Carlos Marcello.
Congressional investigators in the late 1970s found half a dozen people who said that Lee Harvey Oswald was working with Carlos Marcello's pilot and Carlos Marcello's private detective in the summer of 1963.
The key to unlocking the mystery of the assassination and the mafia's involvement lies with the man at the center of it all, Lee Harvey Oswald.